And so I was saying, you can see the coming of Sloterdijk's collapse of the spheres in the 15th century here, in that the mental consciousness structure is the tool that was invented to cut and collapse all the spheres that had carefully contained and bounded man within both the magical and mythical, both are subsumed under the unperspectable world, that had carefully contained them. And so logic brings in its tools now to begin to sterilize and destroy and cut apart the mythical consciousness structure. I think Gebser's mental consciousness now can be seen as consistent with the rise of Nietzsche's and Spengler's Socratic men. They are the ones who bring reason on stage and begin to sterilize the myths out of existence in accordance with the laws of logic. And whereas we had the polaristic thinking as constitutive of the mythical consciousness structure, now we have dual thinking. We have dualisms in which A cannot also be not A. A and not A are mutually exclusive. They can't complement each other in the yin-yang dyadic way of heaven and earth in Chinese thought, where earth is a square that complements the circle of heaven. Those complementarities are gone, and everything is thought in terms of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. So everything is triadic and dualistic in terms of its thinking. And as we had the emotional predominating in the magical, and in the mythical we had the predomination of the imagistic, now in the rational we have the predomination of abstractions and conceptual discourse. So the efficient aspect of the mental consciousness structure is menace, M-E-N-I-S, in the sense of the use of discursive logical thinking as a tool, but later when it decays into its deficient mode it becomes mere rationality. And he says that the beginnings of this are in the mental phase 2, which takes place during the Renaissance around 1500 BC. That begins to sow the seeds for the deficient phase, the descent into pure rationality that's achieved by about 1800, about the same time that Spengler says the Socratic man is coming on stage, which then begins to decline into its deficient phase, where it has been ever since, with this hypertrophy of the I, the ego, and the overemphasis on reason and rationality, which has sterilized the myths out of existence, along with the gods and any possibility of the magical consciousness structure working. So he says that these consciousness structures all remain latent within us. They don't just disappear when a new structure comes along. The new structure comes along and takes the field, but the other structures become latent, and they can be reactivated in each one of us at any time. And part of the integral consciousness structure that came about from about 1870 on is the need to realize this, to realize and render transparent within one's own self which consciousness structures are there, and when and how and when they're active and when they're not, and when they're to be used. That's part of the process of seeing through these consciousness structures so that you realize from what point of view you're operating from, which each consciousness structure has its own bias. So we have the movement from nature to time to space. Space begins to come in now in a new way with the triangle, the vertex in perspectival painting. You can see the triangle shape there. It's very clear with its base resting on the human subject. And that's basically it as far as this chapter goes, as far as the mental consciousness structure goes. He also says, though, one other interesting detail, he has an eye for details, Gebser does, that I like quite a bit, where he says that the Greek invention of reading from left to right, left is traditionally associated with the goddess. The heart's on the left side of the body. It's the sinister side. It's the side that's more in the direction of the unconscious, whereas the right is the side that's closer to consciousness. And so it was, of course, the West that invented the practice of reading from left to right, that is, in the direction of consciousness. And in a number of works of Greek art, we can see the figures beginning to face toward the right. And he says all of this indicates the coming of the rational, the mental consciousness structure that's coming in which, in the West, we have this orientation toward the right, the preference for the right. He says that the letter Y is the perfect symbol of the mental consciousness structure because it shows the fork in the road of left and right, and the preference, as Hercules takes in myth, for the right-hand path. The right-hand path is the path that the West has taken, whereas the left-hand path, of course, is the path that the East has taken. And so the mental consciousness structure has devolved into its deficient mode with the omnipotence of reason, where it's been for a couple of centuries now, and it's in need of renewal with the advent of a new consciousness structure, which he has coming in here with the integral. which he doesn't say too much about in this particular chapter, since he's going to spend the rest of the book talking about it. But suffice it to say, we can remark that the integral is four-dimensional. It brings in time as the fourth dimension, just as Einstein does when he adds time to space and creates a four-dimensional spatiotemporal continuum. And the geometry shifts from the point to the circle to the triangle, now to the sphere. And one of the consequences, of course, as everyone knows, of Einsteinian cosmology is that the universe is now depicted as a gigantic sphere. So the sphere, and the other thing about the sphere is that it's whole. The integral will make whole. In a certain sense, it re-achieves the wholeness of the archaic, Gebser says, the original sense of wholeness, only now it does so with all the knowledge of the subsequent millennia of consciousness structures that have intervened in the meantime, so that now there's a conscious awareness within the realm of the integral, within the realm of wholeness, of what all of these other consciousness structures, the knowledge that it's given us now. So space will have to be put back together with time, and just as the mythical had emphasized the matriarchy and the rational had emphasized the patriarchy, so the integral will balance masculine and feminine, conscious and unconscious, and so on. One of his criticisms, by the way, of Jung that he mentions in this chapter is that with Jung and Freud there is a sort of rediscovery within us of the mythical consciousness structure, but he says it's done from the point of view of a sterile, perspectival rationalism that merely sees the myths as manifestations of emotional states in the psyche. And he says that's too limited a viewpoint, and besides, the dyad of conscious versus unconscious is too simplistic a model of the psyche. And for Gebser, one of the reasons why he wanted to do this, to think of the psyche in terms of these layers of strata, was because the Jungian model of conscious versus unconscious, even if it's a conscious unconscious that's deepened by the addition of the collective unconscious, is still too simplistic. Gebser sees the psyche as having all these layers, these strata that drop down back into time's abysm, way back to the archaic consciousness structure. So we have this grand vision of the awakening and unfolding of consciousness through these consciousness structures. Each one of them is accessible to us today, especially now that we're moving into the integral, where we can become for the first time aware of these different consciousness structures and what their uses are as tools, and also what their limitations are. And then so that sets the stage for his discussion of the integral / a perspectival consciousness structure that he's going to spend the rest of the book moving into.